Well, good morning, everybody. Let me first of all thank the organizers for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I'm going to give you a somewhat different talk to the ones that have gone ahead. I'm not going to touch on safety very much, but you'll see that there is a large overlap between what I'm going to say and what has gone before. We've heard some excellent introductions to these previous issues. So let me first of all remind you again of why we're so interested in nuclear power. One is that you wanted, as a nation, to secure an energy supply. The second, and that's become more and more important over the recent years, is that you wish to cut down the carbon emissions that go in the upper atmosphere and leave a legacy for future generations of the 50, the 100-year timescale. Now, we don't know how great that legacy will be at the moment, but we do know there will be some legacy. Now, I don't often bring a newspaper in to give a lecture, but it was very interesting to me this morning in the International Herald Tribune. On the front page, there's an energy quandary challenges Japan. Because of the activities, just to emphasize how important nuclear power is, that they've not operating the reactors, they've started up again coal, oil, and gas-fired power stations to provide the deficit of power from the reactors. And the estimates are, in Japan's case, that they'll put up 200 million tons of carbon up into the upper atmosphere during the next year, in excess of where they were, and hence not meet their climate goal objectives. And secondly, it'll cost an extra $38 billion in imports of those fuels. That's one of the other costs, those two very important costs of the problems that are ongoing in Japan at present. So it's a really very, very serious issue, and it comes and manifests itself in many, many ways. Now, why are people so concerned about the civil nuclear power plant programs? Well, it lies, of course, in the fact that the nuclear material that you produce during a reactor operation, and you've seen that brilliantly shown earlier today, those materials can be used either in a nuclear weapon or in a nuclear dispersal device. So to give a long-term security and safety to the operation of nuclear power plants, you've got to consider these issues. They are, of course, not independent of what we've heard before. So let me address those. This is what I was going to concern myself with mainly in this talk. So the thing I'm going to talk about, first of all, are the issues that are associated with the activities of individual states, and that means the Non-Proliferation Treaty and non-proliferation in general. Let me remind you that there's a technical definition of proliferation, which is that proliferation means a new state acquiring the ability to be able to make weapons. Now that's different to the problems and difficulties associated with non-state groups. And here we're thinking of terrorist groups. They don't have the facilities of states, and they will use other ways to utilize those materials from a civil nuclear program. So there we're concerned mainly with security of those sites and stopping those groups being able to get access to acquire the materials or to cause problems with those materials. You've heard about the nuclear reactors, the enrichment process, and also the reactors themselves. What I'm going to talk about is the used fuel that comes from reactors after you have actually got out the power that you can from the uranium. And that comes in three different guises. What you do with this used fuel is how you store it, how you reuse it, and then how you dispose of it. What I won't talk about, you've heard about these earlier, is the enrichment and the fabrication of fuel. I won't talk about the construction and operation of power plants. You've heard about that very eloquently in the previous two talks. Let me just note, though, that this is already a very international commercial activity. There are commercial suppliers of uranium, first of all, the enrichment of uranium, the fabrication of the enriched uranium into fuel rods for reactors. And of course, there's also an international market in the construction and operation of power plants, most recently emphasized by the fact that South Korea will be building plants in the United Arab Emirates. You also heard there's an enormous amount of effort gone into the safety and risk assessments in those areas. So that I'm not going to address, except in touch on it occasionally. Now, let's just talk for a moment about the major proliferation routes for individual states. Now, that at the moment is basically the first way is that you could divert nuclear material and expertise from declared facilities on your national territory. Now, that is dealt with by the Iaea Safeguards system. And that to date has proven rather successful in stopping the diversion of those nuclear materials. And also, I think also that the other concern is that those declared facilities that you've recognized are on your territory, also you train people that become more knowledgeable and proficient in the operation of nuclear facilities, nuclear establishments, and handling nuclear materials. Again, that's bound to happen. As people learn about these things, that potential is always going to be there. But at least in declared facilities, you know that that's going on. The other way that states can actually acquire materials for rather bad uses is by the clandestine production of nuclear material at facilities that they haven't declared. Now, those have to be comparatively small facilities to avoid observation. After all, everywhere in the world now is well and truly scrutinized by all of the satellites that we have up above. Also, if they're small, then you don't produce a lot of materials. And there's disagreements again about the efficacy of small plants. However, you certainly would have to be very technically proficient to be able to, from a civil nuclear program, actually acquire material that you could use in weapons. Perhaps the biggest concern about proliferation is the fact that you could have a state that was a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, therefore had access to many aspects of a reactor program and the technologies associated with that, which then withdraws from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And at the moment, I believe that you only have to give 3 months' notice to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is really a very political issue that you have to deal with. What about non-state groups? There, the danger is that they will acquire and use some nuclear materials and an unsophisticated, crudely designed weapon. A lot of people work with a lot of skill in making weapons in the weapon states. It's not easy to make nuclear weapons. You can probably make a crude one which will give a small yield, but you still have to be pretty sophisticated to be able to do that. And the way you can do that is either take highly enriched uranium from an enrichment program. This is why there's a large concern about enrichment programs and the security of those commercial activities that do the enrichment, bear in a dispersal device. This is a normal high explosive which just blows all this stuff over a large area and has then radiological impact on people, not a nuclear weapon. And of course, the final thing that you can do is to use, groups could attack used fuel or high-level waste stores or reprocessing facilities. You heard in the previous talk that a lot of effort had been put into looking at aircraft impacting on nuclear reactors. The same is true of these stores or of reprocessing facilities. I think the main story here is that you can't be complacent about these things. You must actually look to see that you have a secure system, much along the lines you've already heard about for this stage of a nuclear program. Very quickly, you've seen this before. Here is where all the reactors are in the world, and this is what countries hope will happen in the future. And again, this just emphasizes that a large amount of the build that is already occurring will be in Asia to cope with the massive energy needs that will be there. Now, if you're going to generate that power in nuclear reactors, then we expect, as I've just said, that to be dominated by countries that have already got nuclear power programs, or by the construction of these reactors mainly in South and East Asia, again in countries often that have got already established nuclear power programs. This build will be made with thermal light water reactors. Those are the only ones that you know you can make at the moment that are economic and efficient. You also expect those reactors to be operating on what's called an open fuel cycle. You put the uranium in, you operate the reactor, you take the spent fuel out, and you put it somewhere. That's the basis on which the reactors are operated, for instance, in the US. There is another way of operating, and that's in what's called a closed fuel cycle, where you take the spent fuel from the reactors and reprocess that fuel, and that to produce more fuel for use in later reactors. That's the sort of activity that's been followed in Japan and also in Britain and in France. That is an extra stage and an extra cost in the whole activity. It initially may actually become more important in the future when we have the next generation of reactors produced, which will wish to use basically plutonium as many of them as one of the main sources for the reaction, and hence achieving the factor, perhaps not quite of 100, but certainly 50 or so usage of the original uranium that you put into a reactor. So you get a lot more power from those fast reactors particularly. So the one emphasis I want to make here is that whatever you make a fuel cycle, it's coming right through from the original uranium through to the used fuel, the spent fuel, and then what you do with it, there's no proliferation-proof fuel cycle. What you have to do is make a risk assessment, and you've heard lots about risk assessments. They need to be sophisticated to see what the danger of proliferation is in those cases. What you usually find is, of course, is that there's no, as I've indicated, there's no technical pass-fail level in these analyses, and that the proliferation, as I've been talking about it, proliferation is really very much a political problem. Countries, the Iaea will give information on its safeguards program back to the UN, and the UN then has to do something about what evidence it's given. Finally, the risk assessments have to be sophisticated. They really do have to distinguish between whether you're talking about proliferation or security, state or non-state groups. You have to recognize what the usage is of various of these materials are in nuclear weapons. And you've also got to focus on not only what the capabilities of a state or a non-state group are, but also what their motivations are for doing it. Now, what's the best practice to manage used fuel?
Roger. You need to wrap it up, please.
Thank you. Irrespective of fuel cycle choice, anybody embarking on nuclear power has really got to come up with a long-term strategy. That long-term strategy will last over 50 to 100 years. The first 50 of that is 5 to 10 years to build the reactor, 40 to 50 years to operate it, and then you have to deal with the fuel that's come out of those reactors. So you need a strategy to manage used fuel right from the outset. That doesn't mean say you have to have all of the answers right from the outset, but you must have in place a program, a roadmap, which will give you the answers to when you need to make decisions. And I think that roadmap should be based on people participating in international programs so that we all know what is happening or we are all developing things for the common good. And finally, you should look to seek for international fuel cycle arrangements wherever you can, particularly where you have countries with a small capacity. For instance, the United Arab Emirates would not expect to be able to do all of the stages of a nuclear fuel program. So what's the first step? I'm going to go very quickly now. First step is, in any use of these things, you should make the used fuel as unattractive as possible for use in weapons. That means you use a high burn-up of the initial fuel. That requires R&D to make sure and careful design to make sure you can do that. What that does for you is it makes the plutonium mix in the used fuel less desirable for weapons, and you have bigger radiation barriers so people can't get hold of it and handle it as easily. The second step is that this is now concerned with the open fuel cycle, is that you should, there's a lot of experience with this, and you've heard about ponds at Fukushima and places like this. The best practice for dealing with an open fuel cycle would be to minimize the time that the used fuel is wet stored, that's putting it in a pond, before dry storage. Dry storage is something that has been developed a lot more over the last 20 years. And that is more robust than wet storage. And so I think, again, you'd minimize the time in ponds where you have to get rid of the heat from the initial reactor rods and then move it into dry storage. And of course, you could then think of dry storage in centralized storage facilities. These dry store casks where you put the fuel inside them are very large objects. They're not easy to be able to get hold of or handle. They're very heavy and they are very robust. Of course, the other thing you must do is to truly move forward below ground storage, and that leads on, of course, to disposal. If you go to a closed fuel cycle, which is where you separate in the processes in operation at the moment, plutonium, you should minimize the time that you have the plutonium in a separated form. You should co-locate that reprocessing plant with the fabrication plant for what's called mixed oxide fuel. And you should make sure you know where you're going to put that mixed oxide fuel, which reactors are going to burn it, rather than the ordinary, more common uranium oxide fuel. And you should make sure your production of that MOX fuel is consistent with the loading time schedules for those reactors. The other thing, that's a fairly easy sequence to talk about, but I think a lot of it relies on the Iaea Safeguards system. And that really needs strong support, and it needs updating technically to give better and better instruments to make sure you can track where all of this material goes. That's, I think, an area where we could have a lot of international collaboration and development of these measuring devices. We should also, I think, all new states should adopt and implement the IAEA comprehensive safeguards and the additional protocol, which allows the IAEA to go in to look for undeclared facilities in states. And that should become the norm as we keep moving forward during the next 50 years. All states, by the way, with nuclear weapons programs, I believe, to give confidence to this whole process, should separate them from their civil nuclear programs. That's done in some countries already. That's certainly true in Britain and certainly true in France, entirely, and I believe in the US as well. And they should make sure, those weapon states, that all of their civil programs are placed under these international safeguards. The other thing that you can contemplate doing is introducing a cradle-to-grave fuel cycle arrangement. At the moment, there is an international fuel cycle arrangement for the enrichment part of the nuclear program, enriching the original nuclear fuel. It would be good to extend that all the way through to the used fuel. And perhaps that's something that would make the total cradle-to-grave operation work well. You shouldn't drop the benefits from the commercial practices that already exist in the case of the enrichment fuel and fuel fabrication. You should add to that. And I think, again, this would be attractive for countries that have small nuclear programs, and that could then lead to an international commercial market, taking fuel right from the mines all the way through to its final disposal. I should add that in that case, the grave may not be in the same place as the cradle. Before you get to the grave, you've got to do interim storage. As we've seen, you need to store spent fuel from reactors. That again may be commercially attractive to be able to do that, but I think it will only be sensible, the storage, if you have a long-term vision of how you're going to deal with this used fuel. There's no good to go into an interim storage, perhaps in a different country, where you're paying to rent space to store it safely, if you don't have a long-term idea where that fuel is going to end up. In the case of reuse, you'd have to be sure that the facilities that you would model this on the enrichment facilities that services that already exist. That's a very successful market at the moment, which has its own controls, safeguards under IAEA built into it. There could be a similar activity generated for reuse of the fuel, reprocessing and then reuse. And this already happens because, for instance, the United Kingdom and France have both reprocessed fuel from reactors in Switzerland, Belgium, Germany, Japan. And that's been done on a commercial basis. But again, you have to have the same sorts of guarantees that you have in the enrichment program so that people feel confident that their fuel will be safely dealt with. And if they are needing the plutonium in the long run for fast reactors or more generation 4 reactors, that there is the ability to get hold of stuff. Finally, I want to make the point to you that whatever reactor program you have, you're going to have to dispose of something in the long run. Depending on what reactor program it is, it will be slightly different things you will have to dispose of. You hope if you have a fast reactor system, then it'll be down to high-level waste that you are actually disposing. But I want to emphasize at the moment that there's no civil geological disposal facility in operation. There are some under construction in Sweden and in Finland, but none that's there. Everything is in, quote, interim storage at the moment to see how one is going to deal with this. It's not surprising, because if you take my 100 years as a total program length, then we're about 50 years into that activity now, and it's now that you would expect the issues of disposal to actually really be having to deal with as you're turning off your initial wave of reactors. They've been building up spent fuel, and now you have to really set in place a program to deal with it. It probably should have been set in place somewhat earlier. However, it's possible that you could have geological disposal facilities that are sited in one or few countries, and again have a commercial market in disposing of this high-level waste. That comes with a lot of concerns for local communities, and one shouldn't underestimate that by any means. You'd have to have a few GDFs again, so that you don't have a monopoly situation, and so people could be in difficulty. So what we're trying to do here is generate a true international market in the whole of the electricity generation by nuclear reactors. So, I think there are very many serious issues that I've alluded to there.